name is Jim McNutt, or J.P. McNutt, depending on what era of my life you know me as. Was born and raised in Eugene. My grandfather and grandmother, who I've kind of been asked to talk about, were some early pioneers or early settlers in the Eugene, Springfield area. And my first thing I would like to talk about is some of my memories of my grandparents, and I have very, very fond memories of them. I spent a lot of time with them. It was always fun to go to Grandpa and Grandma's house because Grandma would let you do anything. She would say, "Look, Earl, they're dancing on the table. Isn't that cute?" And he, of course, would have nothing to do with it, was not very happy about it. My grandparents were Rhoda, Kathleen, Calloway McNutt, and my grandfather was Earl Lawton McNutt. And Grandma was born, I believe, out near Vaughan. We haven't been able to determine exactly, but there's some references to her house out in the Vaughan area, Blue Vaughan or what have you. My grandfather was born in Burwell, Nebraska, and his family, there's a couple of different stories. The only one I'm able to verify is that the second one. The first one was that the family, looking to find a little better life, came out to the Oregon Trail and wintered in Vancouver, Washington, and as my grandfather put it, starved out, couldn't figure out a place to stay or something to do, so they moved back to Nebraska. My grandfather, at approximately age 12, somewhere in the early 1890s, he was born in 1881. During that time, at 12 years old, he was asked to travel out to Oregon to look at a piece of property up the McKenzie River, and he was going to stake the corners and make sure it was what the person had represented, and if it was, the family was going to move. So at 12 years old, he got on the train. Was very excited. I'm sure it was probably his first train ride. He was given some new clothes to make the trip and a brand new hat, which he was very excited about, probably the first new hat he told me he ever had. And as the train got started, away it went. The window was down, and he was just amazed at all the scenery and how things were going by, and stuck his head out the window, and the hat flew off. He never saw it again, so it was a rather short-lived experience with the hat. But he did come out here, walk the property, determined that it was what it was, and the family then went back to Nebraska, and the family moved out here, I think, about a year later. Talked about a wagon train and that his job, he rode a horse most of the time, herding a couple of cows, and they had sold the cows, I think, in Boise, Idaho. He said he was never so glad to see those cows go because his job was not one of his favorites. But he talked about a specific number of days. I don't remember. I think it was like 3 months and 11 days. He knew exactly how long it took him to get here. But anyway, so the family settled up on the McKenzie River. Some of the other things that I remember about my grandfather is that he always, one of the fond memories that I have of my grandfather and grandmother is driving to the ranch. They owned a piece of property out in Lorain area, west of Eugene, and we used to drive out there at least every Saturday, and as I said, I used to spend a great deal of time with my grandparents, and that was one of my favorite times. We'd get in the car, and as soon as we got out of the city, so to speak, which was at that time 18th and Chambers Street, past the old airport, it was country, and I'd get to sit on my grandfather's lap and drive at probably 6 or 8 years old, which was quite a thrill to be able to steer. And one of my grandfather's favorite things was to teach. And he felt education was extremely important, even though he never made it past, I think, the 8th grade. He continued to learn and read and study about things, and he was constantly quizzing my brothers and myself about what kind of tree is this, particularly on the trip, to the ranch. What kind of tree is this, and tell me all about that, and what kind of cloud was this in the sky. And constantly felt that educating yourself and learning was extremely important. So that was one of my fond memories. Asking if pine tree was where pineapples came from. Him telling me with a smile, "No, I'm sorry, it's not. They do have some similar, but that's not the one." So that was some of my most fond memories with my grandparents. My grandfather was kind of an unusual stature. If you say he was about 260 pounds and 5 feet 6, so he was pretty round, and he did like to eat. And so he spent quite a bit of time at the Osborne Hotel, had a nice restaurant there, and met my grandmother, and things went from there, and they ended up getting married. They built a house on High Street, 871 High Street, when they got married, and lived there until they both passed away in 69 and 1977. And anyway, so that house was just recently moved. My grandfather did a number of other jobs in his young career after he got married, and then eventually went to work for the Eli Bangs Livery Company in Eugene, which was located on 8th Street, about a block from his house on Pearl Street. And he worked there a number of years and eventually became a partner in the Bangs Livery Company. And they would loan out horses and equipment for people to dig driveways and basements and things like that. And the equipment was always coming back, and the horses were coming back in really bad shape, and they'd been abused. And so he decided that rather than subject them to that sort of stuff, that he would go out and do it himself. And that sort of led into him being in the construction business, primarily in the highway construction business. And so he kind of got away from the delivery part of it and ended up doing construction, first with his brother, Jack McNutt. And then I have seen pictures, although I can't find them, of a team of probably 40 horses in a row pulling the equipment to grade a road. He built a lot of the roads around here, Route F to the coast, and a number of other things. So that was how he got started in the construction company. And my father eventually joined that company, and it was sold in 1969. My grandfather also, during his term at the Bangs Livery Company, drove stagecoach. And he drove from up near his family home in Walterville up the McKenzie River to Notai and over to Florence. And that was one of the times that he used to talk about that he met a lot of fun to people on that job. Later in life, after he became a little older, was still a partner in the McNutt business. The two brothers, he and his brother Jack, split the company in about 1957. They couldn't get along all the time, and Jack was a completely different individual than my grandfather, and they decided that in the best interest of both of them, they would just split the company down the middle and each go their own separate way, and they did. And but my grandfather became interested in politics, and I believe in 1942 approximately, he ran for and was elected mayor of Eugene. And I remember seeing a lot of pictures of the various dignitaries that came to town, and the mayor was obviously to meet them and greet them. And then later, I believe, served in the Oregon legislature. I'm not quite sure which branch, and on the Eugene Water and Electric Board. So he was very civic-minded, loved Eugene, just felt it was a great place to live and wanted to help out any way that he could. So he was very active in those kind of things later in life. Actually, I do remember he was also granted or awarded the Eugene First Citizen Award, which is an award given yearly to kind of a outstanding citizen, I guess. So he was very, very proud of that, to be recognized. Later in life, my grandmother was extremely religious. She lived right across the street from the Baptist church. She bragged that she'd gone 62 years without hardly missing a Sunday. My grandfather, I think, went 62 years without ever making a sermon or a visit to the church. So it was always interesting. The Baptists are obviously very, very conservative, and so we would go to the Baptist church. And again, later in life, my grandfather, I believe at age 86, was baptized in the church. I don't know whether he was worried about my grandmother had been right all those years, or he just decided to please her. Not really sure of the motivation, but it was quite an event to watch the baptism in front of the entire Baptist church of my grandfather in his middle 80s. My grandmother, again, as I said, was eventually a deaconess in the Baptist church and was very actively involved in it. And they were doing an expansion and were asking for donations. Of course, my grandmother said, "Oh, I'm sure we can donate something." So I went to my grandfather and my dad, and they put their heads together and decided that they would donate some money to build a certain part of the building or what have you, if they would name it after my grandmother, the Road of McNutt. which they did. So that was pretty exciting. When I went to the church, I have to go by the road of McNutt room on my way to Sunday school, so that was kind of fun. My grandfather, similar thing, that sort of brought on another thing. My dad was involved in city council at that time, and they were building a new city hall, and because he'd done something for my grandmother, thought it would be nice to do something for my grandfather, and again donated some money to the Eugene City Hall, and they named a room after him, the McNutt room, Earl McNutt room, I think kind of because of his involvement in early Eugene politics and stuff, but that's, I'm asked about that a lot if I'm related to the guy whose room has my name, and I am proudly. As I said, my grandfather was in the highway construction business most of his adult life, and early in the Banks Livery Company, but he always thought he should have been a farmer and thought he would be really good, so whatever money he earned in the construction business, he used to buy property. And my grandmother was born, as I said, out in the Vaughan area, near Crow. I haven't determined exactly where that is, but she had a lot of friends out in that area. And during the Depression, when my grandfather was building roads and doing construction projects, making a little money, most people were losing their property, unable to keep it because of taxes or various problems during the Depression. And so my grandmother often pleaded with my grandfather to help somebody out there, and he would, and so he ended up buying some property on Lorraine Highway, which we owned for many years. So sometime during the Depression, he bought several parcels of property out there, and I know I heard one story that sort of sounds like he might have taken advantage of people who were in dire straits, but I've heard that he really gave some people some money for the property that they would not have received otherwise. And one of the people got back on his feet. This is a story that someone besides my family told me, that one of the families got back on their feet and wanted to buy the property back, and he sold it to him for $1. So it was kind of a nice thing that he wasn't always interested. One of his famous lines about buying property was, Earl, you seems like you want to buy every piece of property around here. He said, no, I just want to buy the stuff that borders me. Well, eventually it all borders you as you continue to expand. He also bought property in Montana. We did some early highway construction work there in Montana, and we owned a rather large wheat ranch up there. And I used to go up there and visit in the summertime and drive up with him and spend some time. It was some of my other fond memories of him. But so he purchased pieces of property all around the area wherever he could, in hopes that he could someday turn out to be a farmer. About the best he did was we never lived on it, nor did he, but he used to go out and boss him around, I guess, or tell him how things ought to be. So he always enjoyed that. Was a big part of his life, the property, particularly on the Lorraine Highway that I talked about earlier, that we used to drive out to on a regular basis. So he was quite the character. I admired him immensely. I remember, being in the room and hearing some of the stories about my grandfather and his brother not getting along in the highway construction business. Jack McNutt, his brother, was a very gregarious, outgoing, rough individual. The other thing that was interesting about my grandfather and his brother, they always wore a suit, three-piece suit. As I said, they were both rather rotund individuals and had to have them custom made. But, here's my grandfather out there in the cow barn milking cows in a suit and rubber boots. So occasionally he would take his jacket off if it was really dirty, but it didn't matter what he was doing, dressed up going out or working in the barn shoveling manure, he was wearing a suit. So he and his brother just didn't get along. My grandfather was a little more conservative, and I had heard that they'd gotten in quite a fight and had a real go-round. And so Jack, his brother, went to the construction company, and there was a gentleman who was big like my grandfather, had a large stomach, and he said, come on, you got to go with me right now. And Arnold, the guy's name, said, well, what for? He said, just come with me and don't worry about it. So they drove to the Packard dealership here in Eugene, and because my grandfather, as I said, was rather big, they always had to move the seat back from the stock position. So, he'd get in there and they'd figure it out. So Arnold was about the same shape as my grandfather, so he said, sit in this car. We got to figure out how much to move the seat back. So Arnold got in, and they measured and figured out how much to move the seat back so my grandfather could get in. And Arnold said, well, what's this all about? And he said, well, Earl and I are kind of in a little go-around, and I'm going to buy him a new Packard and hope that that'll kind of settle things. So the story is that I don't think it worked, because they eventually did still break up, but kind of an interesting story about my grandfather. As I mentioned, he used to go to the ranch every day, and as he got older, he kind of had a series of incidents, if you will, driving, and so we decided to get him a driver. The guy kind of helped around the house, and so my grandfather lost his license rather early compared to most folks today, and so he always had a driver, and sometimes he'd sit in the back, most of the time he'd sit in the front. There's sort of a story around that, Earl McNutt was being driven around by his chauffeur-driven car. Well, it was typically a four-door Ford, cheapest one he could find, go pick a color that nobody else wanted. Had a teal blue one, I remember specifically one. But so anyway, he would go to the ranch several times a week and get out and kind of check on things. And he absolutely did not want to walk under any circumstances. He would get in his car to drive across the street. As I said, he was a rather large man, so that was kind of a funny story. So we're out there on the ranch, and the cows are being herded, and he was telling the guy they were doing it wrong. And so he told the driver to get out of the car, and he got in the front seat of the car, moved it back, and started herding cows in his 59 Ford four-door out through the field doing 40 miles an hour trying to head off cows. And that was always quite a sight. He, like I say, it was interesting herding cows in a 59 Ford. One of the other stories, again, that I heard secondhand, some folks in the Lorain area were doing a little history, and one of the gals that wrote the book, Pat Edwards, called Sawdust and Cider, it's kind of a neat story about some of the early families, talked about, my grandfather being chauffeur-driven out to the ranch all the time, and, being the property owner in sort of a less than positive way, I guess not. And she said one day she was taking her kids to town. She had 4 kids, and it was pouring down rain, and she'd had a flat tire not too far from her house near our ranch. And my grandfather drove by and asked her if everything was okay, and she said, no, I've got to get to town, and I have a flat tire, and I don't know how to change it. So anyway, I'm sure my grandfather didn't, but I'm sure his driver did, jack the car up, change the tire, and she never forgot that. Thought from then on that he was a nice individual, and some of the stories about him being whatever were not true. He was genuinely a caring and giving guy. So that's just some of the stories that